Jonah was returning from the mercantile with a jar of carbolic acid balanced carefully in both hands when 4 riders came around the corner of the dry goods store at a controlled trot, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this particular kind of work before. "Boy," one of them said, swinging down before Jonah could react, "you're coming with us, and if you don't make it difficult, nobody has any reason to hurt you at all." The jar shattered against the boardwalk as Jonah tried to twist away, and a hard hand closed around his arm before he'd taken 3 steps, dragging him toward a waiting horse with the practiced efficiency of men who had planned exactly this. His shout carried across the street, and Cyrus, 40 yards away checking a wheel hub on the parked medicine wagon, came up straight with a speed that surprised even himself. 3 days earlier, before those 4 riders came down from the ridge, and before Jonah's shout cut across Redemption's main street, the medicine wagon had been quiet. Cyrus Wade had no reason yet to know that an old act of mercy was already riding back toward him. Cyrus measured willow bark into a tin cup with the same unhurried care he brought to everything he touched, and did not look up when the wagon's canvas flap stirred behind him. "Careful with that lantern near the ether case, Jonah," he said without turning. "Second time this month you've near singed your own eyebrows off." Cyrus measured willow bark into a tin cup with the same unhurried care he brought to everything he touched, and did not look up when the wagon's canvas flap stirred behind him. "Careful with that lantern near the ether case, Jonah," he said without turning. "Second time this month you've near singed your own eyebrows off." Jonah, 13 years old and still growing into hands too large for the rest of his still narrow frame, set the lantern down exactly where he'd been told, and grinned despite himself. "You always know without ever looking," he said. "One day you'll teach me that trick instead of just doing it at me." "It's not a trick at all, really," Cyrus said. "It's paying attention to what's actually in front of you instead of what you merely expect to be there. Most men never learn the difference, and it costs them considerably more than singed eyebrows eventually." The medicine wagon had rolled into the yard behind Redemption's mercantile 3 days earlier, one stop on a circuit Cyrus Wade had ridden for 11 years through the scattered settlements of New Mexico territory, treating fevers and broken bones and difficult births for families who couldn't afford the nearest town doctor's prices or the 2 days it took to reach him. Redemption itself was a modest cluster of adobe and clapboard around a dry goods store and a cattle association office, kept solvent mostly by ranchers driving stock north to the railhead at Cimarron Junction. Jonah had spent those 3 days the way he spent every single stop on the circuit, running small errands for families too far from the wagon to come themselves, carrying tonic bottles to the widow Alvarez's sick daughter, and splints to a rancher's boy who'd fallen wrong from a hayloft the week before. Half of Redemption's children trailed after him by the second afternoon, the way children trailed after anyone who treated them as capable of helping, rather than simply being helped, and by the 3rd morning even the mercantile owner had stopped charging him full price for carbolic acid and clean bandaging cloth. Jonah had come to ride with Cyrus 4 years earlier, the only survivor of a fever that had taken both his parents and 2 sisters inside of a single terrible week, in a settlement Cyrus had reached one day too late to do anything but confirm what the boy already knew. Cyrus had buried the family himself, since there had been no one else left to do it, and had found the boy sitting alone beside the graves with nothing to his name but a torn coat and a silence that had taken most of a year to finally break. "You don't owe me anything for taking you in," Cyrus had told him more than once in that first difficult year, sensing the debt Jonah carried like a stone in his chest. "I lost a boy of my own to fever once, long before I ever met your family, and I couldn't save either of you from it. Riding together doesn't settle that account. It just means neither of us has to carry it alone anymore." Cyrus was 58 years old, built compact and steady, with gray hair kept short beneath a plain wide-brim hat and pale blue eyes that had seen considerably more of the human body's damage than most men saw in 3 lifetimes. He carried himself the way older men carried themselves in towns that mostly overlooked them. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to mistake for nothing more than a traveling salve and tonic peddler if a person didn't look closely at his hands or the worn leather surgeon's kit he kept locked beneath the wagon's driver bench. Word had reached Redemption 2 weeks earlier that Garrett Cole's gang had hit 3 ranches and a stage station in the county to the south, and the Cattle Association's autumn payroll, due through town by week's end to cover 4 months of drive wages, had every rancher in Redemption checking his rifle twice a day. Sheriff Otis Dunmore had exactly 1 deputy and no telegraph line to call for help, which Garrett Cole, by every account of his careful planning, had already counted among the reasons Redemption suited his purposes considerably better than towns with better protection. The association manager, a nervous man named Preston Cade had wired ahead to Cimarron Junction requesting an armed escort for the payroll shipment, and had been told plainly and without much sympathy that none would be available for another 10 days at the very earliest. That gap, 10 uneasy days of an unguarded safe sitting inside an undefended town, was precisely the window Garrett Cole had built his entire careful plan around, and precisely the same window that made every family in Redemption a little more watchful than usual with strangers passing through. Garrett Cole had built his gang out of deserters and drifters over 3 restless years, men who valued his planning and his willingness to avoid unnecessary killing when a robbery could be managed without it. He was not, by the standard of men in his profession, especially cruel, only patient and precise in the way he studied a town before hitting it, which was exactly the quality that had kept him uncaught through 3 counties and considerably more robberies than the newspapers had ever printed accurately. He spent a full, careful week scouting any town worth the eventual risk before ever committing his men to it, learning the sheriff's habits, the bank's schedule, and whatever single point of leverage would keep a frightened population from organizing faster than his crew could work. It was this same careful habit, the patient collection of small useful details about a place before ever riding into it, that had led his scout to notice how many families in Redemption seemed to know the traveling medic's wagon boy by name. 3 of his men, however, carried a history with Cyrus Wade that Garrett Cole knew nothing about, a debt none of them had ever found the words to mention to their leader, because mentioning it would have meant explaining a night 8 months earlier that all 3 had silently agreed was better left buried. Ezra Bowen, Dax Merrill, and a lean, nervous rider named Silva had been badly wounded in a robbery gone wrong near Cimarron Junction, and had staggered, half dead and bleeding, into the one wagon camp along their escape route that showed a lit lantern after midnight. Cyrus Wade had treated all 3 without asking their names, without asking what crime had put the bullets in them, following the same rule he'd followed since his first year as an army surgeon during the war. A wounded man on his table was a patient first, and whatever else he was second, and the second question was none of a medic's business unless the wound itself demanded an answer. He had dug 2 bullets out of Ezra Bowen's shoulder by lantern light while Jonah held the boy steady and pale with fear, and had said nothing at all when the 3 men rode off before dawn without paying him so much as a word of thanks. That night had stretched on well past 3 in the morning, the wagon's single lantern throwing long, unsteady shadows against the canvas, while Cyrus worked in near silence, his instruments laid out with the same precise order he'd learned treating men on battlefield tables decades earlier. Dax Merrill had passed out twice from the pain before Cyrus finished cleaning and stitching the gash along his ribs, and Silva, the quietest of the 3, had simply gripped the wagon's side rail and stared at the canvas ceiling without making a sound the entire time, the particular silence of a man who had learned somewhere never to let anyone hear him hurting. Ezra Bowen had left one thing behind that morning without meaning to, a tarnished brass button from a Union Corps coat he'd worn a decade earlier and kept as a private keepsake through everything since, dropped somewhere in the wagon bed during the long fevered night. Cyrus had found it weeks later while cleaning the wagon, and had pinned it, without quite knowing why, to the inside of the doorframe where he kept his surgeon's license, a small unexplained thing Jonah had asked about once and never gotten a clear answer to. Garrett Cole's plan for redemption was, by his own careful accounting, straightforward enough not to require excessive violence. Hit the Cattle Association office the morning the payroll arrived. Keep the town too frightened to organize a response for the 20 minutes it would take to clear the safe, and be 3 miles gone before Sheriff Dunmore's single deputy finished saddling a horse. The one variable Garrett hadn't accounted for was a scout's report that the town's most beloved resident wasn't the sheriff or the association manager at all, but a quiet traveling medic whose wagon boy ran errands for half the families in town, and whose absence, taken as leverage, would guarantee exactly the kind of frightened stillness Garrett needed. "Take the medic's boy," Garrett told his men the night before, laying it out with the same flat precision he brought to every plan. "Town won't risk a shot fired anywhere near that wagon, not with how much they need the old man's doctoring, and we'll have the boy back to him inside the hour once the payroll's clear. Nobody gets hurt who doesn't force it." Ezra Bowen, listening from the edge of the fire, felt something cold settle low in his stomach that he did not share with the rest of the men. He had never told Garrett Cole about the wagon camp near Cimarron Junction, or the old man's steady hands working a bullet free of his shoulder by lantern light, and he understood now, with a clarity that made him feel slightly sick, exactly whose boy Garrett intended to take. Cyrus had noticed the same 2 riders pass slowly along the ridge above town twice that morning, unhurried in a way that felt deliberate rather than idle, and had mentioned it to nobody. filing the detail away the way he filed away every small irregularity that crossed his attention. He had meant to walk over to the sheriff's office after finishing the wheel hub and mention it properly, a decision that came 10 minutes too late to matter once the riders finally came down off the ridge and into the street itself. Jonah was returning from the mercantile with a jar of carbolic acid balanced carefully in both hands when 4 riders came around the corner of the dry goods store at a controlled trot, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this particular kind of work before. "Boy," one of them said, swinging down before Jonah could react, "you're coming with us, and if you don't make it difficult, nobody has any reason to hurt you at all." The jar shattered against the boardwalk as Jonah tried to twist away, and a hard hand closed around his arm before he'd taken 3 steps, dragging him toward a waiting horse with the practiced efficiency of men who had planned exactly this. His shout carried across the street, and Cyrus, 40 yards away checking a wheel hub on the parked medicine wagon, came up straight with a speed that surprised even himself. "Let him go," Cyrus said, crossing the distance at a fast walk rather than a run, hands visible and empty at his sides. The rider holding Jonah's arm, a broad man with a scarred jaw Cyrus didn't recognize, laughed without much humor in it. "Old man's got some nerve," he said. "Boy's coming with us for a few hours, and you're going to stand right there and not make this harder than it needs to be." 3 more riders had positioned themselves at the mouth of the street, watching the exchange with rifles held low but ready, and Cyrus's eyes moved once across all 4 of them with the specific unhurried attention of a man taking a full inventory before deciding anything at all. His gaze stopped on the second rider back, a lean, nervous man with his hat pulled low, and something in the man's posture, the way he sat his saddle slightly favoring his left shoulder, tightened Cyrus's expression in a way none of the raiders noticed. "Ezra," Cyrus said, quiet enough that only the nearest men heard it clearly. "Dax, I'd have thought you 2 learned enough manners the last time we met to keep better company than this." Ezra Bowen went rigid in his saddle, and beside him Dax Merrill's hand froze halfway to his rifle stock, both men caught in the particular paralysis of being recognized by exactly the one person they'd hoped never to see again in circumstances like these. The broad man holding Jonah's arm, whose name was Fletcher, looked between them with obvious confusion. "You 2 know this old man?" he asked. Neither Ezra nor Dax answered right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Fletcher's confusion started curdling into suspicion. Garrett Cole, watching from horseback at the edge of the group, felt the same suspicion sharpen into something considerably more focused. "Somebody want to explain what's happening here," he said, voice flat and cold in a way that made even his own men straighten. "He dug 2 bullets out of my shoulder 8 months back," Ezra said finally, the words coming out low and reluctant, as though each one cost him something. "Cimarron job that went wrong. Me, Dax, and Silva staggered into his camp near dead, and he never asked our names or turned us in. Just fixed us and let us ride out." Garrett Cole absorbed this without any visible change in his expression, though something behind his eyes was recalculating rapidly. "That complicate anything for you?" he asked Ezra directly. "Or are we still taking the boy same as planned?" Ezra hesitated a beat too long before answering, and that hesitation told Garrett everything the words themselves hadn't. "The boy's not part of this," Cyrus said, stepping closer despite Fletcher's grip still locked around Jonah's arm. "You want the association payroll? Take it and ride. Taking a child as leverage isn't strategy, it's cowardice dressed up as planning. And I'd have expected better arithmetic from a man careful enough to avoid 3 counties worth of posies." Garrett's jaw tightened at that, the insult landing exactly where Cyrus had aimed it, though his voice stayed level when he answered. "The boy makes this town sit still for 20 minutes, he said. "That's the whole of the strategy, old man, and I don't much care whether you approve of it." "Then you've made a mistake you don't understand yet," Cyrus said, "and I'd rather explain it to you now than let you find out the expensive way." He held Garrett's gaze steady, unhurried, the same attention he'd have given a difficult diagnosis, and something in that stillness made 2 more of Garrett's riders shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Silva's dead," Dax Merrill said abruptly, breaking his own silence for the first time. "Fever took him 2 months after Cimarron, out past Socorro. Would have taken me 2 if this man hadn't shown me how to dress the wound right before we rode off that morning." His voice had gone rough in a way that surprised even himself. Garrett Cole looked between his 2 men and the old medic for a long, calculating moment, weighing a debt he hadn't known existed against a plan he'd built carefully over 2 weeks of watching redemption from a distance. "Sentiment's a luxury," he said finally, though the words carried less conviction than they had 10 minutes earlier. "Fletcher, get the boy on the horse. We're behind schedule." Fletcher hauled Jonah toward the waiting mount, and the boy, remembering nothing Cyrus had ever taught him about fighting because Cyrus had never taught him to fight at all, did the only thing he could think to do, which was go entirely limp, dead weight dragging against Fletcher's grip in a way that slowed the man down without giving him anything solid to strike back against. "Cyrus," Jonah shouted, voice cracking with fear he'd been holding back until that exact moment. "Don't let them—" "I'm not going anywhere," Cyrus said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, and something in his voice had shifted from the quiet, unremarkable tone Redemption had known for 3 days into something considerably harder underneath. "Garrett Cole, you've got 4 men here who know my name, and only 2 of them have told you why yet. Ask Fletcher sometime why the 3rd one's gone so quiet." Every eye in the group turned to the 4th rider, a younger man near the back who had said nothing at all since the confrontation began, and whose face had drained of color at the sound of his own unspoken guilt being named aloud. "Tolliver," Garrett said sharply. "You too?" The young rider, whose name was Cole Tolliver, no relation to Garrett despite the shared surname that had caused confusion in the gang more than once, nodded once, miserable. "Wasn't at Cimarron," he admitted, "but my brother was before he died at Socorro, same as Silva. This man rode 2 days out of his circuit to bring my brother's effects back to our mother himself, because nobody else would trouble themselves over an outlaw's family." Cyrus remembered that ride clearly, a small locked box of letters and a worn pocket watch he'd carried across 60 miles of bad road because a dying young man had asked him to, with no promise of payment and no particular reason to agree beyond the same rule that governed everything else he did. He had found the mother in a one-room house outside Socorro and had said only that her son had spoken of her at the end, leaving out the considerably harder details she hadn't needed to carry alongside her grief. Garrett Cole sat his horse in the middle of Redemption's main street, with 3 of his 5 men now visibly unwilling to complete the simplest part of his plan, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a careful man watching careful planning come apart, that the arithmetic of the morning had shifted considerably against him. "This changes nothing about the payroll," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "We can still clear that safe with or without the boy as insurance." "You can," Cyrus agreed, "but you'll do it with half your men wondering whether the next town's medic is somebody they've already met too, and wondering what kind of leader spends debts like Fletcher's about to spend one right now." Fletcher's grip on Jonah's arm had already loosened without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it happened, the fight gone out of a task that had stopped feeling simple the moment 3 of his own crew objected to it in front of him. Sheriff Otis Dunmore came around the corner of the Mercantile at that moment, with his deputy and 2 armed ranchers behind him, drawn by Jonah's shout and moving with considerably more urgency than Garrett had planned for this early in the morning. "Drop it, Cole," Dunmore called, rifle already raised. "Whatever this is, it's over before it starts." Garrett assessed the new arrivals with the same rapid calculation he'd applied to everything else that morning. 4 armed townsmen added to 3 unreliable riders and 1 furious old medic, and found, for the second time in 10 minutes, that the numbers no longer favored the plan he'd spent 2 weeks building. "Fletcher," he said, quiet and final, "let the boy go. We're leaving." Fletcher released Jonah's arm without argument, relief plain on his broad face, and the boy stumbled backward into Cyrus's steadying grip with his breath coming in ragged gasps he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Garrett Cole wheeled his horse to face Cyrus one final time before giving the order to ride, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You've cost me a payroll and half my crew's nerve in one morning, old man," Garrett said. "I don't imagine we'll meet again on terms this friendly." Cyrus held his gaze without flinching, one hand still resting on Jonah's shoulder. "If we do," Cyrus said, "I expect I'll treat whoever's bleeding first, same as I always have. That's not friendship, Cole. It's just the only rule I've ever found worth keeping, regardless of which side of a fight a man's standing on." Ezra Bowen lingered a half-second longer than the rest before finally wheeling his own horse to follow, and in that half-second his eyes met Cyrus's with something that might have been apology, or might have simply been plain recognition, the particular look of a man who understood clearly he was choosing wrong and doing it anyway because the alternative meant abandoning men he'd ridden beside for 3 hard years. Cyrus held the look without judgment, the same steady attention he'd have given a wound he couldn't fully close, and let him go. Garrett studied Cyrus a moment longer, then turned his horse and rode out of Redemption at a hard gallop, his 5 men trailing behind him in a loose, uncertain column that no longer moved with the confidence it had carried into town an hour earlier. Sheriff Dunmore lowered his rifle slowly, watching the dust settle over the road south, and turned to find Cyrus already kneeling beside Jonah, checking the boy's arm where Fletcher's grip had left dark bruising already rising beneath the sleeve. "Nothing broken," Cyrus said, more to himself than to anyone listening. "Bruised deep, but nothing broken. You'll ache for a week and have a story for considerably longer than that." Jonah managed something close to a laugh despite the tremor still working through his hands. "You knew them," he said. "The two who talked. You actually knew them." Cyrus helped him to his feet, brushing street dust from the boy's shoulder with the same careful attention he brought to every wound, major or otherwise. 8 months back, 3 wounded men came into our camp near Cimarron Junction in the middle of the night, Cyrus said, guiding Jonah toward the wagon at an unhurried pace that let the boy's legs steady beneath him. "I dug bullets out of 2 of them and dressed the 3rd's wound as best I could, and none of us ever spoke of it again until this morning. I didn't know their names were Ezra and Dax until Garrett said them out loud, and I certainly didn't expect either debt to matter enough to change anything today." "You never asked if they were outlaws," Jonah said, working through the shape of it slowly. "You just fixed them." Cyrus nodded, settling the boy onto the wagon's tailgate to examine the bruised arm properly in better light. "During the war, I learned early that a man bleeding out in front of you stops being anything but a patient the moment your hands touch him," Cyrus said. "Confederate, Union, outlaw, lawman, it stops mattering the instant the bleeding does. I've held to that rule for 30 years now, mostly because I've never found a good enough reason to abandon it, and this morning it turns out to have saved you considerably more directly than I'd ever expected it might." Sheriff Dunmore approached as Cyrus finished wrapping Jonah's arm, hat in hand, something like awe still working across his weathered face. "You know you likely stopped a robbery and a kidnapping both, standing there unarmed in the middle of the street," Dunmore said. "Whole town's going to hear about this by supper, whether you want them talking about it or not." A small crowd had already gathered along the boardwalk by then, the mercantile owner and 2 ranchers and the widow Alvarez among them, watching the old medic with an expression that had shifted, in the space of 10 frightened minutes, from casual familiarity into something considerably closer to reverence. One of the ranchers offered, loudly enough for half the street to hear, to cover the cost of every bottle of carbolic acid Cyrus had sold that week, an offer Cyrus declined with the same quiet firmness he declined most attention paid to him. "I'd rather they didn't talk about it at all," Cyrus said, tying off the bandage with practiced efficiency. "I'm not in the business of being talked about, Sheriff. I'm in the business of fixing what's broken and moving on to the next town before the fixing turns into a reputation I have to live up to." Dunmore studied him a long moment, understanding, perhaps for the first time, exactly what kind of man had been quietly rolling through his town 3 days at a time for longer than he'd bothered to notice. The gang did not return to Redemption that season, word reaching town by autumn's end that Garrett Cole's outfit had splintered somewhere near the Texas line, 3 of his riders having simply ridden off one night and never rejoined the others. Ezra Bowen, Dax Merrill, and Cole Tolliver turned up separately at a mission outside Socorro some months later, according to a traveling preacher who passed through Redemption with the news, each of them quietly abandoning the outlaw trail without any of the 3 ever fully explaining why to anyone who asked. Garrett Cole himself was arrested the following spring outside Las Cruces, betrayed, according to the newspaper account Cyrus eventually read weeks after the fact, by a man he'd trusted with too much information and not nearly enough loyalty, the same fragile arithmetic that had cost him Redemption's payroll, finally catching up with the whole of his operation. Cyrus read the account twice through, folded the newspaper without further comment, and did not mention it again to anyone, understanding better than most men that a story's ending rarely needed his own opinion attached to it. Cyrus heard the story secondhand and said nothing about it beyond a small, private nod that Jonah caught but didn't fully understand until years later. He kept the tarnished brass button pinned inside the wagon's doorframe exactly where it had always been, a small, unremarkable thing that had, for one morning in Redemption, mattered considerably more than either the man who left it or the man who kept it could have predicted. Jonah asked him, weeks afterward, mending a wagon wheel together in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon, whether he'd been afraid standing in the street facing 4 armed riders with nothing but empty hands and a voice gone hard. Cyrus considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave everything, turning a spoke slowly in his weathered fingers before answering. "I was terrified," he said. "Every second of it, terrified for you in a way I haven't felt since I buried your family. But being afraid and being useless were never the same thing in my experience. In 30 years of patching men back together, taught me that the steadiest hands are usually the ones shaking hardest underneath, provided a man's learned not to let the shaking reach the surface where it can do any harm. Jonah turned that over for a while, watching the wheel spin slow beneath his own careful hands, an apprentice's grip finally beginning to look something like his teacher's. "Reckon I understand that better than I did yesterday," he said finally, and Cyrus allowed himself something close to a smile, the particular quiet satisfaction of a man watching a lesson finally take root somewhere it would last. "You handled yourself remarkably well that morning too," Cyrus added, setting the finished wheel back onto its axle with a practiced shove. Going limp instead of fighting a grown man's grip, that wasn't panic at all. That was thinking clearly under real pressure most grown men never quite manage, and I'd be lying if I told you I taught you that particular trick myself. Widow Alvarez pressed a small parcel of dried peaches into Jonah's hands on the quiet morning they finally left, insisting the boy eat something sweet after the terrible fright he'd taken, and the mercantile owner shook Cyrus's hand twice at the wagon's tailgate, an unusual display for a man who'd barely nodded at him 3 days earlier. Cyrus accepted both gestures with the same quiet, slightly uncomfortable grace he accepted most kindness, understanding that refusing them outright would have cost the town something it needed considerably more than he needed his own privacy preserved. The medicine wagon rolled out of Redemption 3 days later on schedule, same as it had rolled out of 40 towns before it, Jonah handling the reins for the first easy stretch of road, while Cyrus checked his supplies and restocked what the town had needed most. Behind them, Redemption settled back into its ordinary rhythms, the payroll arriving safely the following week under an escort the association manager had finally agreed to hire, and the story of the quiet medic who'd faced down Garrett Cole's gang bare-handed slowly hardened, despite Cyrus's own preference otherwise, into exactly the kind of local legend he'd spent 30 years trying to avoid becoming. There is a particular kind of courage that asks nothing of a man beyond the willingness to keep doing, calmly and without exception, the one thing he has always believed to be right, even when the person standing in front of him wears an outlaw's coat instead of a soldier's uniform. Cyrus Wade had spent 30 years treating whoever bled in front of him without asking which side of any war they stood on, and it had cost him nothing he could name, and saved him, on one ordinary morning in a town he'd meant only to pass through, more than he had ever expected a single old habit could, a debt repaid not in coin but in the simple, unlikely mercy of men remembering a kindness precisely when it mattered most. Take care of yourselves out there. Until next time, keep riding.